socio-political issues, one man searches for intelligent conversation. From Dedham, Massachusetts, the birthplace of modern democracy, this is You Don't Have to Yell, with your host, Dan Sally.
Welcome to episode 39 of You Don't Have to Yell. It's the bad boy of nonpartisan political podcasting here on your number one source for unfounded home remedies for the coronavirus now that White House press briefings are apparently a thing of the past. Now, being the last week of the month, I thought it fitting to invite the data monkey back to discuss this month in numbers. And when we were planning the episode, I thought negative $37 a barrel oil was the weirdest thing on the agenda. And then a White House briefing happened, which may or may not have contained a recommendation for ingesting bleach. Something the Data Monkey and I will actually debate during this episode, along with a few other items of contention around a president who is nearly impossible not to argue about. Now, there's a conclusion at the end that's going to determine the direction of this show going forward. And as always, I'm going to let it sit at the end like a prize in the bottom of the cereal box, and you're just going to have to eat your way through. Or you can be a big fat cheater and take the bag out and then reach your hand in and get the cereal all grubby for everybody else. You know, if that's your thing, go for it. At any rate, I'll be back at the end to explain further. I was going through the outline I had from our conversation earlier this week. For those listening, you know, typically Mike and I will connect usually a few days at least, or maybe a week before, just to kind of sketch out what we're going to talk about. And I thought the outline we had was pretty weird before the president suggested that people inject themselves with disinfectant. He really doesn't make it very easy for me to plan these things.
You know, it's funny you said that because we were going to touch on hydroxychloroquine and we can talk about why, so listeners understand why I'm obsessed with this topic. It's not for the reasons they might think. And I wrote down when I was sketching on my pad, like the things we talked about. I added next to this drinking bleach. So we could touch on that as well. Because I think, what we were trying to get at with this topic is, why does everything become politicized, including stuff that has no business being politicized? And that was my, and this is why I think we were going to talk a little bit about, the obscure lupus and malaria treatments of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, how they entered the national conversation.
Yeah, so let's get to that. The weirdest thing in the news prior to that was that we had negative $37 a barrel oil. And I had cooked up a little scheme where I was going to buy negative 78 million worth of oil and then just rent a tanker for $40,000 a day until the price went up. But then you informed me that little scheme was not possible, correct?
Well, I mean, in theory it's possible, but not to secure it in the time that you would have needed to take advantage of that.
Like, I personally could not have orchestrated that deal.
No.
Okay. What would I need ahead of time to be able to have orchestrated that deal?
Well, you have to know how to access storage and get it, actually, contracted, which would have been very difficult to do in a very short period of time when this actually sort of took place. Well, let's back up, because what you saw was the WTI, which is the sort of West Texas Intermediate crude, was what went negative. And that's because that is the most like liquid and traded futures contract for the oil in the US, right? So in that market, you end up with, that has a very specific that has very specific parameters attached to those contracts. They're standardized because they trade, on a commodities exchange. So they have to be very standardized. And that contract has a specific time and location of delivery, right? So they do these on like a monthly contract expiry. And so what happens is you have like the front month comes into its last day of trading, and all these contracts generally have to be closed out because very little actual physical trading of oil happens around that contract expiration. But in theory, it would. So the contracts are written that effectively you have to be ready to take delivery at a place called Cushing, which is the Oklahoma, where there is the sort of the main delivery point that they use for these contracts. So you would have to be ready to take delivery on that at that time, the contract expiry time, at that point, right? So only 14% of the actual storage capacity of the U.S. is at Cushing. So there's only like something like 85 to 90 or million barrels of storage capacity. No one really knows exactly because they never top these things out entirely. So it's very hard to know what the total capacity really is. But it's estimated around something like 90 million barrels of storage capacity. And that's versus like the total U.S. storage capacity is estimated at like 650 million barrels or something.
Okay.
Right. So you're only talking about like, 10 to 15% of the total storage capacity is at this point, but you would need to be ready to deliver it on that date and time. So even if you were to be able to find some random storage off in, another place, because this is, once you start, especially once you start to get very filled on storage, like we start, every closet that could possibly hold a barrel of oil's got it in it, right? So you start having to track down where there would actually be excess available capacity.
Yeah.
To store. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you know what image is going through my head right now is, do you remember the I Love Lucy episode where Lucy and Ethel are working at the chocolate factory?
Yes.
And the boxes keep coming out and they can't put the candy in the boxes fast enough. So they start eating it and shoving it in their shirts.
You got it.
Is that kind of like what's going on here?
Yes.
With oil?
And the shirt you're stuffing it in globally is what they call floating storage. So floating storage is when we just start renting tanker ships that normally carry it and we just park it. So, right, we've estimated now there's something like, the articles, it's never exactly clear who's just parking oil and who's moving it. So there's an estimate of how much is actually in floating. But the store, as of even just a few weeks ago, or actually just a few days ago, I guess, the estimate I saw from Reuters was that there's about, maybe 160 million barrels of crude sitting in floating storage. That's above and beyond just like the storage on land, right? So and to put this in context, we use the world uses like 100 million barrels a day normally, right? That's what the normal amount would be sort of daily, but that's not. But right now, the problem is that number's collapsed by. We're not entirely sure, but it could be as much as sort of 20-30% that it's down.
Yeah. So somebody got rich using my plan.
Oh yeah. Basically. Some people will make money. And the flip side of that is other people will get absolutely laid out. So like the problem, and you've already heard some people, there were some talk of different institutions that losing money on this because, because they were forced to close out a contract like that. So So going back to my point is that, I think the number is 20 times or something. The actual physical volume of oil that trades is traded on just paper, right? So people just taking positions in oil price, and then they have to close those out by that time, or they will have to take delivery or in effect, right? So you must close it out. So as we get closer to the expiration date of each of these contracts, what they end up talking about is like a front month roll. So the contract rolls from like the new, like when the April contract expires, the front month or the new 1 month contract becomes the May contract, right? So when that contract rolls over, everybody has to sort of clean up and cash out, right? So on that front month contract. And the problem is if you're really upside down in terms of the number of people long versus sort of the number of people short those contracts, and you don't have oil to deliver or you don't have storage capacity to take it, you must close that out at whatever price you can close it out at. And the problem is there was such an imbalance going into the close that it ended up showing up as a negative number briefly.
Yeah. And so for those of you who don't have the data monkey around on a regular basis to explain things to them like this, basically the deal is that in any commodity, you know, oil, gold, pork bellies, grain, oranges, whatever, they sell contracts, and effectively a contract is an agreement to buy that said commodity at a given price. And what that does for the producers is it ensures there is going to be a buyer for them at a given price once they get that thing out of the ground, whatever it is. And so in this specific case, a bunch of oil producers or a bunch of folks had contracts out to buy oil at a given price. So the relationship between the supply of oil and places to put it was vastly out of whack. And so the people who would have to have taken receipt of the oil, the people who had agreed to buy oil at a certain price, had nowhere to put it. And so nobody wanted to buy their contract. Is that more or less it?
Basically, you got it. You got it. Okay. And the signal, it's interesting because you hear people sort of respond. It's like, well, that means we must need more storage. You're like, hell no. What we need is people to not produce. So that pricing signal is just telling people who have existing wells to turn them off. Like there's drilling a well, completing a well, and then there's actually continuing to have that well produce. And in some cases, you've seen those big, the big sort of jackhammer things that you'll see in movies, like when people go out by an oil field. That's called artificial lift. And that is the stuff they use to actually continue old wells like producing. They're actually adding like some pressure into it, so they're pulling some more out, right?
Yeah.
Shut that off.
Yeah.
Shut it off. So that's what the signal from the market is basically saying. It's not that we need more storage. It's to shut off the existing production because it's absurd. And so it'll force companies to do when you get a price signal this bad is that they will start shutting the stuff off. And the reason why it takes something as extreme as a zero or even negative price is because the marginal cost, as you can imagine, of a well already drilled, and you're just maybe even applying artificial lift. You don't, in those pictures of the artificial lift jackhammer, they're going up and down. You don't see a lot of people around that thing, right? It's just kind of going. It's just doing its thing. So the incremental marginal cost of running this stuff and producing is pennies, right? So that's why you get such an extreme price signal, because it's telling every producer to basically be like, shut that shit off. We have to, we stop producing. You can see, because we've never had like a demand, like such a short-term demand destruction of this size. And you can start doing the math when I say this, like, you just say, all right, again, nobody knows entirely what global storage capacity is, but some of the more respectable data services out there would say there's something like 1 billion, 1.2 billion total barrels of global oil storage capacity. I'd have to audit that number to know how much is onshore versus floating or whatever, but let's just say that number's right, okay? I mean, if the world normally, if you go back to sort of the economy of 3 months ago, we were using sort of 100 million barrels a day. And in literally less than 3 months, we've cracked that. And that's 100 million barrels a day. So stop and think about that. I mean, that's, you're talking about like 37 billion barrels per year.
I love that you said the economy of 3 months ago. That's what this whole, like the last few years have been like. It's like, I know I keep going back in the database for references, but do you remember the movie Troll?
Oh yeah, like the old one, not the one my daughter watches. The old one.
No, the old one, not Trolls. There's actually an old movie, like 1980s. It's about I don't even remember.
The shitty horror movie, yeah.
It was terrible, but it was about this kid moves into an apartment building. I guess he befriends a troll. I'm not going to do the synopsis properly, and I wouldn't advise anybody watch the movie to.
It's not worth revisiting to get this. Let's just assume it's correct.
Exactly. But basically what happens, kid befriends a troll, a whole bunch of weird shit starts happening in the apartment building. Like, fairies start flocking around sinks, and like ivy's growing over everything. And, just the whole place kind of transforms, and it just gets weirder and weirder as time goes on. And that's what like this whole era has been like.
Yeah. It gets weirder by the day.
It's one more bizarre thing after the other. And I guess too, I know one of the things we had noted on the outline prior to the whole drinking bleach thing was the whole hydroxychloroquine. Did I pronounce that correctly? Hydroxychloroquine.
To the best of my knowledge, yes. You have pronounced that correctly.
So Trump makes a claim about the benefits of hydroxychloroquine. Everybody gets upset about it. Everybody says he's irresponsible. Everybody says he owns a stake in it. First off, why is he saying it? And secondly, it seems like this whole owns a stake thing is kind of blown out of proportion.
So I think, this is good because you and I talked about this offline. It's important we talk about this, I think, on the actual podcast because we should, as a topic, I think we need to address it. I think you and I are in agreement that generally we see signs that both sides of the political spectrum have lost their fucking minds.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, lost their minds.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether that's just because like the worst 5% of each side seem to be in charge.
Yeah,
that could be the case.
Mm-hmm.
But every single thing becomes not only politicized, but insanely exaggerated and spun. And my current pet peeve, aside from which is related to this, is the inability for anybody to read beyond like a headline, a spun headline, or the first paragraph of a news report. Like you didn't go beyond, like get to the third or fourth paragraph. Like my tip for anyone would be like, when you see a headline, don't even bother reading the lead paragraph. Jump to like the fourth paragraph.
Yes.
And find the actual factual information driving the headline. Because more often than not, it's been wildly overstated what's actually in the headline. And that's his advice to anybody. Like, I'm not talking about, this is not for pro-Trump or anti-Trump. Just in general, that's just a good thing to do. Go look at the data in the actual article. Like, what was the factual information that drove the interpretation for the headline?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I think too, the other thing is like folks need to click on the source of a lot of these articles, because generally, like, my rule of thumb is that if the headline looks like it's designed to make you angry, then like source the shit out of that thing.
Yeah, like, that's another good way of putting it.
Yeah, because ultimately, like, and you see this especially on the more like fringe sites like Breitbart, and you could even potentially, I wouldn't lump Mother Jones in there, but there are definitely some on the left, like Addicting Info. I don't even know if they're still around anymore or not, but effectively what they do is they put out these sensational headlines. It's designed to get you mad. Most folks don't read it because, like, if you actually read or were actually interested in like understanding the issue, you wouldn't be reading a site called Addicting Info to begin with. And then, everybody just gets more agitated. And I think you see this with, the whole argument about Trump sort of being corrupted by his stake in Sanofi it's just ludicrous because everybody owns a stake in Sanofi pretty much, right? Like if you have...
Oh, not to mention, and we talked about this, like, I mean, so hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil, this is like the brand name. I mean, This has like been around for, I mean, I think you can just wiki this. I mean, I know it's been around since the 50s. It's been used to treat things since like the 1950s. I think its origins go back further than that. It's been around since the 1930s. I'd advise anyone to just look at the price to earnings multiple of any generic manufacturer to tell you, like, will tell you a lot about the profitability of making generic drugs. This is just a widely available generic drug. Even though the government was buying like 30 million doses of this stuff to stockpile it, right? It's going to be a blip, if anything, and not enough to even make like a penny of earnings for these companies. Well, so the idea that it's like nefarious financial greed driving it is really stupid. It's more just, I think it's just idiocy and a need to like an insane need to prop up a claim that he made sort of off the cuff. Like,
well, that's it. And now nobody's accusing him of having like steak and Clorox after this latest announcement. So yeah, I think he just kind of, like you said, I think he just is speaking off the cuff and saying some stuff presidents probably shouldn't say, because people listen to presidents, believe it or not. And I think it seems like the whole conspiracy theory is a bit off.
Well, it just seems to me like the most obvious answers are usually the right ones. And we've seen time and time again, like someone in his orbit mentions something or shows him something, and then he just like coughs it up in a briefing. Like, because how much content can you put together? I mean, the guy's doing daily briefings, right? How much content can you possibly put together to do a daily briefing? So he's just up there riffing. Like, yeah. And then, but what I think is fascinating, and this is more the importance of why we were touching on this topic, is this lining up that whatever he said must be right or must be wrong along your political spectrum. Oh yeah. Not just like, oh, he says a lot of stupid shit, so maybe that's right, maybe it isn't, who knows, I'll wait for some actual data. Versus like, if he said it, it must be right, or if he said it, it must be wrong. It's like, it has to be a panacea or it has to be poison.
Yep. Yeah. Yes. And I think that's, and you see that across everything. I think the interesting thing about what's going on now is the fact that we literally have a way to more or less within 3 to 4 weeks determine if everything being said about COVID-19 is correct or incorrect. It's not like climate change where we have to wait 30 years to figure out who's right. Like 4 weeks. And even with the reopening of the states, again, you would think that the whole idea of listening to doctors would be a nonpartisan issue, but yet it is. Yeah. And not only that, it's partisan depending on which day of the week it is. Because one day we may be looking to liberate Michigan, the next day we may decide opening Georgia is a bad idea. Yeah.
And and that's fine. Like, it's only crazy people who don't change their opinion when confronted with new data.
Yeah. Yes. And I do think that it kind of strikes to the problem of today, which is, COVID-19, for all it is, it's also a regional problem in the sense that it's going to impact Manhattan differently than upstate New York. It's going to impact Boston differently than rural Georgia. And I get why a state like Florida, a state like Georgia, a state like Colorado, for example, might decide to ease restrictions on a municipal level rather than a statewide level. Right. That makes sense. That makes sense to me. If you are in a rural environment where social distancing is just kind of like what you call everyday life, the restrictions are kind of nonsensical, Right. Whereas in Manhattan, again, where people are just on top of each other, the restrictions make more sense. And I think it's just, to your point, people can't separate the data from the person, and they can't separate their opinion of the person from how they interpret the data.
And they don't even bother to really try. Yeah. Right. This is what I think is sort of insane, is that we just kind of end up, like grabbing whatever talking point we hear to bolster our preconceived position on it. Yeah. And it's like, and let's try to make sure I don't just do this, imply that this is just like right wing Trump supporters, because I see it on both sides of this quite a bit. Like, again, it's not just the defense of it, but also the attack of it. Like, it'll kill you. It causes heart rhythm problems. Oh my God, don't take hydrochloroquine. It will kill you instantaneously. Like, this is insane that he would even like float this idea. And you're like, well, okay. It's insane that he would float the idea for a different sets of reasons. One, he's not a doctor. He shouldn't be out like on his, Twitter feed, advising people or suggesting that people take anything. Like, whatever, right? That's just fact. I don't care. Like, I don't care who the president is. They shouldn't be out advising people on medical things, especially on social media. But maybe that's my opinion. But okay, I just I think it's sort of insane for that reason. Yes, hydroxychloroquine has side effects, sure, and one of those is like heart arrhythmias and that. But this is also widely taken by people who have lupus. Like, because this is so if you have, so what's happened is then you saw a spike in prescriptions for this around. I don't know that that's entirely has to do with Trump. That could be also just doctors acting independently because they're allowed to do that based on the data that they've seen, right? Which some of the similar data that Trump was sort of referring to or had heard of. I doubt he was reading papers on it. As you saw the spike in it, which was then causing a bit of like a shortage of this available for people who take it for other reasons, right? For like rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and things. So now you have like, that's going to happen. So the market will respond. They'll make more of it because it's a generic. So there'll be plenty of it available eventually. But I think coming back to the point that, like, I don't know that was necessarily Trump driving it, but he definitely amplified it. And so therefore, you saw more of this use.
As always, I hope you're enjoying the show. And also, as always, like the deadbeat uncle who keeps coming for money, I have a favor to ask. Now, the dysfunction we see in government is not the result of two ideologically opposed factions recommending different platforms, but of two parties that know they just need us to get to fight with each other to retain power. And the only way to fix it is for people like you and me to demand more from the people we put in office than being the lesser of two evils. Now, I've got some plans that I'm going to be discussing at the end of the show, but right now, I need you to help me get the word out, and there are a couple of ways you can. Number one, as always, is to click share right now, like right now, and share You Don't Have to Yell with friends, family, and any sundry randos you have lurking around your online networks. Number two, follow YDHTY on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube by searching You Don't Have to Yell. We're going to be putting out bonus content in the coming months that you are not going to want to miss. So please check it out. And with that out of the way, back to the data monkey. I think the big disconnect is, the people who support Trump ultimately made their choice as to whether they took everything he said at face value a long time ago. And they've got their own sort of calculus as to why Trump is a good president. Trump sort of harkens back to this old image of America that they knew. In other cases, it's some people just like the theater. Some people just like him because he sticks his thumb in the eye of the establishment and they're feeling left out of it all, and on the flip side, which is, my side currently, I see a guy kind of postulating as to whether it makes sense to inject yourself with bleach, and so I think it's, I think that's just the environment we're in. And so if you want to sit and kind of talk about, the latest crazy thing he said, which I think is pretty much what every media outlet except for Fox does, then that's all that's all the, if you're going to dedicate your coverage to every dumb thing he says, that's going to be the 24-hour news cycle. And it's also going to be, it's also not going to make a bit of difference
Yeah.
All it's going to do is it's going to convince the people who are convinced he's dangerous and incompetent that he's dangerous and incompetent. It's going to convince the people who are on his side that the media is against him. And it's going to allow these dumb things to control the news cycle rather than maybe some stuff that might be more relevant to our day-to-day lives. And I think the problem, for as I see it, is, folks are voting with their amygdala.
Yeah.
Folks are voting fight or flight, and folks' political opinions are determined fight or flight. And you can't say the word like gun control, for example, or you can't say the word AR-15 without folks instantly getting to their battle stations and getting ready with all the stuff they've been pumped up with to validate their side when you haven't even said what your opinion is yet,
Right.
And I think that the main issue in my mind, and I know like this is going way back to September now when we looked at kind of the two-party system and how it's structured, is that when you have a system where you can only vote, or where you have a system like ours where all you need to do to win office is get one more vote than the second most popular candidate, then people will naturally choose one of the two parties most likely to win. It's called Duverger's law. Political scientists know all about it. And people effectively, when in a first past the post system like ours, which again means you win 51%, you win all of the vote, you win the seat. People will choose between one major party or the other. And third parties will always be throwing your vote away. And you see this in generally, if you look globally, you look at first past the post systems, they all tend to result in this like polemic, hyper partisan, very, situation. Like, Brexit's a great example.
Right.
Brexit was a first past the post referendum. It won by a razor thin margin.
Yep.
And both sides are equally intractable today as to whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
No,
that's right.
And yeah. And so in my mind, when I look at how do we ultimately not necessarily solve any specific issue, but how do we just make sure that the mechanism of democracy is working as it should? How do we make sure that the representative democracy we have is truly reflecting the will of the people? I think the first thing we ought to address is the fact that we have two parties that only really need to make you afraid of the other,
right,
to do their job.
And you can see it. And I think what's amazing is you see it with the consuming bleach thing, because so he did not actually say that. He did not. I've gone back, I listened to it. I was trying to understand exactly what was said.
Tell me about this. Yeah.
It's not what he said. Now, I happen to, again, this is my opinion, and I'm definitely firmly in the view of the Scott Adams view of that we all watch the same movie and come to different conclusions in a hyper politicized world. So let's just say that, again, this is obviously just my opinion, but I say that as someone who really, really does try to not take a immediate reactionary position on anything. I try to gather news articles. I try to gather sources from, I go out of my way to try to see what Fox News says and, MSNBC says, so I can try to merge the two and figure out what we're all referencing, right? Which is, I'd advise anyone who actually wants to sort of maybe try to understand what's really happening and not just be a victim of the game of persuasion that's going on here. I will say Trump was sort of strangely riffing on a couple of things, right? It seemed to me that the science was being discussed was that sunlight seems to kill the virus, and detergents seem to kill the virus, right? In So therefore, he was sort of riffing on, one, is there a way to intravenously get this stuff into the body to rid it of the virus, right? In the first case, it would be sort of IV, quote, sunlight, right? Which is actually not totally bananas. Like, you could imagine through like fiber optic scopes and things, you could actually go in and sort of do artificial sort of light therapies on things to try to kill off virus that's in your lungs or something, right? That's not insane. It's certainly feasible. I don't know. I'm not up on the current science on that or how good or effective it would be, but it's not totally weird. Similar kind of point on the detergents, the weirder, right? Like, my interpretation of what he was saying was that, he's just like openly brainstorming of like, is there a way for like a medical professional to apply some kind of washing of like, your lungs or something to get rid of it? Like, now it may be stupid. I kind of probably think it is. Maybe there's stuff out there that's been discussed. I don't know. I really have no idea. But I certainly didn't hear anyone saying you should inject yourself or consume detergents in order to get rid of the coronavirus. But the next day, every single person and many of my acquaintances and friends who are on social media and things are like, "Oh, I've seen it all. He's now telling the country to drink bleach." And I'm like, "Oh, no, I didn't hear that. I don't know why, but you heard it, and now we're just now it's fun to just amplify that and to make memes about it, and so the game of persuasion continues." Do you think
he just sort of freestyles, and he's just got such an insane level of confidence that he doesn't really second guess the ideas popping into his head, and so he just throws stuff out, and it doesn't mean he's going to execute on them, but it just means he's kind of just throwing out some ideas.
I can't read minds, so I don't know what he's thinking, but it seems to me from observation that whatever just happened to be in his orbit near time, he just coughs it up because he's filling so much airtime. It's not like he's plotting out everything he's saying. It's just kind of, just do the math on how much airtime he has to fill.
It certainly doesn't sound like he's planning this.
Yeah. And it's just, he's not, they're daily trying to they're scripting a show daily. You know how hard that is to do? You and I have a hard time getting just like, one episode together in a month.
Seriously.
And they're like doing these daily briefings. And no one said he had to do daily briefings, but he's doing daily briefings. And there's not enough new information day to day for really there to be that much to talk about. So he's just filling up a ton of space, which means he's just going to sort of say things or ask questions or pose them. And he's not necessarily a expert on any of these topics. So he's just sort of asking questions of or interpreting and misinterpreting things he's hearing from other people who are maybe more knowledgeable on it. So I don't think I'm saying anything really controversial. I think this just seems to be the reality of it. But the problem is that what I find more fascinating about it, is this immediate and intransient lining up around it. If he's just brainstorming and riffing out loud, why are we either taking it as like it has to be true or it can't be true? And I go back to sort of the timeline of this hydroxychloroquine. The only reason we're sort of talking about this because I think it's an interesting insight into how this is these sort of mental traps are falling, right? Like, as far as I can tell, we go back to sort of March, and there's a French scientist who has a paper out there with this claim that they treated, 80 patients that they gave them hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, which is like, a Z-Pak, like the antibiotic that you would normally take. Now, an antibiotic would do nothing on a virus, from my understanding, but it's more about keeping opportunistic bacterial infections from happening while you're also simultaneously fighting the virus, again, I know very little about this stuff, but based on the stuff that they're treating with hydroxychloroquine, like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, it would seem to be an immunosuppressant of some kind. So it's kind of this idea that your body is the body itself is kind of killing you in some stages of coronavirus because of COVID-19, because you've got you're mounting almost an inappropriate response with your from your immune system, and so you're almost turning it down back to sort of a normal, volume. But that then leaves you open to sort of other potential infections, like a bacterial pneumonia or something, right? So you take the Z-Pack. So that's a perfectly good theory of why it might work. There's nothing totally insane about that, I would think, at least from what I'm hearing. And so that comes back to this paper that was sort of published that they treated 80 patients and almost, and in some ways, I think it should have been immediately suspect just because the success rate was so high, right? Like they treated like 80, and it's like they had 79 of them are fully cured. There's like, we don't see that in many trials very often, right? Like, so you should already be sort of scratching your head whether that's legit. But the other important point is there was no control group. So they basically just treated patients, and then they said, this came out with this data. So the most important thing about any of these type of scientific things is that, one, you'd rather see a control group if you can get one. It's a little bit questionable as to how you do that with something like this, because that can be unethical to sort of be not treating. So like, you can't be giving placebos to people if you think something's going to be like, if they're potentially in a life-threatening condition and you might, you're just giving them, nothing versus giving them something, right? So most of these are going to be against sort of any other standard of therapy. So it's it makes it harder to untangle what the outcome would be.
Yeah.
But more importantly, so to come back to this, that to my understanding is the germ of what started this, right? So someone in his orbit talked about this miraculous sort of level of treatment outcome. Mm-hmm. And so then it comes out in a press briefing, and we start talking about it. And now immediately everybody's sort of lining up to be like, we're waiting on the results of hydroxychloroquine. Everyone should get it. We should be giving it to everyone. We should put it in your orange juice in the morning because it's the greatest thing ever. Meanwhile, the data that comes in from no one's reproduced this type of result in any of the other studies that they've come in. Some of them have actually been shut down early due to like heart rhythm problems again. Even though the Brazilian study was actually chloroquine, which is antimalarial, not hydroxychloroquine, which is what for lupus or RA. Mm-hmm. So it's not totally, but you just haven't reproduced anything close to these results. And then what I think is interesting, and I don't mean to get totally in the weeds on this, but the only thing I found fascinating about it was then there was like a VA study that came out where they treated 368 people with a chunk of them, a chunk of them getting hydroxychloroquine, a chunk of them getting hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, and a chunk of them not receiving any of these things. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's the closest thing to a controlled trial you're going to have. It's not. There's no actual control group. There's no people are going to argue over whether the size of that thing. I mean, all kinds of questions about it. But actually, it showed it was actually had a negative effect. So you had 27% of patients dying who were taking this versus 11% who weren't. Right. So that would actually be alarming. Oh my God, don't do that. Now, I don't think that the study necessarily proves out that it's bad or good. It's another question mark. And so immediately it's when that study came out, I saw it out on Twitter, or saw it out on, social media, and people are saying, well, this kind of puts a bullet in the hydroxychloroquine story. And people are just responding well, the study it didn't have this, it didn't have that. They're all in the weeds on the study. And I'm thinking to myself, the only reason you care is because Trump referenced a study indirectly from a month and a half ago that was a shitty trial to begin with. So why are we so anchored to this result that was a bad study?
If you weren't reading medical journals prior to the statement, don't start today.
Yeah, Dan, you always have such a good way of always summing up in a much more clear way what I'm trying to get at.
That's it. It's like people, and I've seen this happen. And again, you're right. It is on partisan lines. I've seen this happen where, first off, people always say, "Oh, I've been looking at the data."
That being said, I'm guilty of it too, because I'm in stuff I'm not supposed to I'm not an expert in. But that
Well,
being
yeah,
said, but that's, if anything, if I have any skill set, that's the skill set, right? Is I can cram and get a B.
Yes, but I think that, yeah, that's it. And I think that what you have is there are a lot of people in an agitated state just looking to stay agitated, and we're designed for it. It's not a partisan issue in Germany. It's not a partisan issue in France. It's not partisan in Italy. It's kind of partisan in Brazil. I've been kind of keeping an eye on things there, but that's just because their president says ridiculously dumb shit.
Well, maybe that's actually a good point too, because that's a good way to sort of wrap up the conversation, because the punchline here is Spain and Italy are the two countries where hydroxychloroquine has been the most prescribed. If it had a miraculous effect, we'd know.
Yeah, my feeling on this whole thing, and I think it's something we've kind of touched on again and again and again and again and again and again and again, is that if you take a look, if you boil down both parties and kind of what they do in action, they're generally doing the same thing. You know, it's like Coke and Pepsi. They kind of taste a little different, but they're both pretty much the same, and you shouldn't be having them anyway. You know, and I feel like the reason we are in an agitated state is because the way you win elections in an environment like that, where there is no real significant differentiator when it comes to the bread and butter issues of healthcare, education, and the economy, right? Is you need to pick these issues that people just can't help but fight about. That is why elections typically are run and partisan identity is typically held in your views on guns, abortion, I would say now immigration, well, now everything. Mm-hmm. You know, climate change, hydroxychloroquine.
It's just, Dan, it's what, I can tell you the only way I would like to make America great again. Here it is. Mm-hmm. I'd like to make it okay for people to just say, I don't know enough about that to have an opinion on it.
Wouldn't that be grand?
Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? As opposed to people just either go and actually form an opinion that's not, mm-hmm. Directed to not confirmation bias, not going out and picking a bunch of information to support your position you already had, asking yourself why you have that position in the first place, but ask an honest question and go look for an answer, right? As opposed to just sort of lining up with, a set of talking points that have been pre-canned for you from one mm-hmm. side or the other. Or just don't have an opinion about it. That's perfectly okay.
100%. 100%. And I think the thing that we find again and again is, and both sides are very guilty of this, they build this straw man where on the left you have this image of this gun-toting, bigoted, anti-gay, redneck out there that, wants to teach us that we all wants to teach us that the earth is 5,000 years old. And then on the flip side, on the left, you have these Antifa mobs that want to suppress your religious freedom and take away your guns and make everybody answer the call to prayer 5 times a day, and that's what our dialogue is now. And so, like you said, you can't not have an opinion.
Which is just insane. I mean, it's just the idea that you're taking some obscure drug and mm-hmm. and it becomes if you don't think this is a good drug, it's because you hate America and you don't, mm-hmm. You hate the president, you don't support him. You're like, no, I just looked at the data and it's nothing supporting it being that excited about it. I mean, it might help, I'd readjust your expectations to something more like it reduces hospital stays by 1.2 days, in people who've taken it. That's a normal type of result for not a miraculous cure. Nothing's ever seems to be a miraculous cure.
The
separate side of that is, yuck, yuck, yuck. The president said to drink bleach. I'm like, no, he fucking didn't. Stop. What? That now you literally now have a bunch of the country thinking that's what he said, and they didn't bother to actually try, or even when they went back and listened to the clip, They heard what they want to hear, which was that he somehow intended to drink bleach. Like, no, he didn't. Like, stop. Yeah. I remember back when Jon Stewart was like, I remember he had like years ago, he went on like Crossfire or something.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he was like,
Tucker Carlson and Bill Press were with him. I remember
and he was just like, stop hurting America. Like, why are you hurting America? And I think that's right. Not that I'm going to say I've been a huge supporter of Jon Stewart. I think it's just the reality of that type of like hyper partisan opinionated positions is that it's not helpful. It's actually really bad. And it leaves you really open to manipulation.
And that's where we are. And that's why, kind of getting back to the beginning of this, when I said, the response to the disease, the response to coronavirus should be regional. We don't need, you don't need to care about what people in Florida are doing if you don't live in Florida. You don't need to care.
Yeah.
Right? I don't need, it's not your concern. Where do you live? Follow whatever the guidelines are there. If you live in Montana and there's nobody around you, you can leave your house. If you live in Manhattan and you have 1 million people within 1 square mile of you, it might be advised to stay indoors as much as possible.
And everywhere you go is, a taxi cab or a subway car. Yeah,
yes,
you might want to be mindful of that.
Dude, people were carrying Clorox wipes around in Manhattan before this thing broke. Okay? Yeah. So they're very germ aware. So I guess the bottom line is like you said, it's okay not to have an opinion over what somebody in a state you don't live in is doing. It's okay.
Yeah.
And that's the way this country was designed. You cannot manage. And I think the problem is that we've, over the last 20, 30 years, we've had a degradation of local media.
Yep.
So a lot of the local issues that really impact you aren't being covered.
Yep. Degradation of local politics as a result.
Absolutely. You have 24/7 news cycle so they always have to, they have to give you a reason to have your eyes on them at all times. And then you have this two-party duopoly that generally has won elections by fear-mongering against the other side based on issues that, again, don't really impact people all that much in their day-to-day. And those three have made this trifecta that has resulted in where we are right now. And kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier about some of those earlier episodes, if you look at the countries that have the highest level of satisfaction with their governments and with their elections, they are all proportional in terms of how they allocate members to parliament. They are all so you go to Germany, 10% vote Green, 5% vote Communist, 50% vote for a centrist party, 45% vote for another centrist party, on and on. That's exactly how it's broken down in parliament. And when I look at this country, I think what we're doing because of that breakdown is we're looking for the federal government to do stuff it wasn't designed to do. It was not designed to cater to these regional needs. It was designed to govern when all states could agree on something.
Right.
And that should be difficult to do.
Yep.
It should be difficult. And I think, and my personal opinion here is if you look state by state, Congress on the whole, again, the House of Representatives on the whole, if you break down the popular vote to the allocation in Congress, it's pretty much on the mark by about 1%. And that's cool, right?
Yep.
But if you go state by state, it's a far different story. If you look at the difference between the popular vote in North Carolina, for example, versus the way their representatives are allocated, you have 50-50 Democrat Republican. It's 75% Republican in terms of their congressional delegation. You go to Ohio, again, it's something like, let's say 60% Republican, 40% Democrats. They have 11 Republican representatives, 1 Democrat.
And these are gerrymandering states.
Gerrymandered, yeah. Look, Massachusetts, where we live, 20% Republican in 2018. Now, for those of you who don't live in Massachusetts, don't know Massachusetts, if you cast a Republican ballot, you might as well have not shown up to the election. There's just zero chance. Still, with that, 20, yeah, same here.
It's just like lighting it on fire. There's no real point.
Yeah, I mean, why? Yeah, it's fun.
It's like a protest vote.
But exactly. But think about this. Okay, so 20% voted Republican, knowing there was zero chance they were going to win. Right? We have 9 representatives. All 9 are Democrats. And so my big takeaway from all this is that we, with gerrymandering, with the first past the post system we have, again, the way that because we allocate representatives in a disproportionate fashion, we basically create a situation where the partisans thrive. Because if you were in a gerrymandered district, you are not going to run on a centrist platform. You are going to run as far to the fringe so you don't get primaried. And so what you end up with is a House of Representatives that's filled with a bunch of people who are unlikely to compromise and unlikely to, give an inch for the common good. And so this is just a result of that. And, in my mind, keep the Senate the same, keep the Electoral College, keep these systems in place that are designed to protect the smaller states or less populous states. But state by state, fix the way we allocate members to Congress. Make it proportional. Open up the door for third parties. I bet you anything if you just changed the districting structure of Massachusetts and made it, 4 districts instead of 9 and allocated votes proportionately. So again, we got our 20% Republican delegation and our 80% Democrat or whatever it turns out to.
Yep.
I bet you anything, number one, we would nominate more moderate Republicans. We'd probably have more moderate Democrats going in there. And we may even have those third parties that everybody wants to see. And I think you could do that on a state by state level. You don't even need the federal government to get involved because they have no jurisdiction over it anyway.
And actually I would, we'd have to unpack this, but I suspect that the current system of the federal allocation would work better if the state by state was done this way.
100%, because you're not sending these lunatics into Congress. And more importantly, there is a legitimate choice now. So now it's not just enough to take money from your donors and then just scare the shit out of your base into voting for you. Now you actually have to understand what the majority of people want and govern to that instead of coming with this platform that has effectively been written for you. And so we're going to explore that. Now, we learned way back at the beginning of this podcast in September that when you have a system like ours, where you only need one more vote than the second most popular candidate to win election, people are going to line up behind one of 2 major parties. It's a phenomenon known by political scientists as Duverger's law. And in the case of the United States, we have 2 parties who win elections by pitting the most partisan factions against each other rather than competing for the true majority of voters in the center. Now, we've also learned that the folks who lean furthest from these extremes are the least likely to vote and generally have a negative view of the system as a whole. So we actually have a system that suppresses moderates. And I have no doubt that the divisiveness in this country is a direct result of our first past the post system. And there is a simple fix. Keep the Electoral College the same. Keep the Senate the same. They're both designed to prevent what the Founding Fathers called the tyranny of the majority. The idea that a few populous regions would rule the entire nation. But the House of Representatives is designed to be a body that proportionally represents public opinion. So end the congressional district as we know it. Don't redistrict in a bipartisan fashion, because that only means the parties are going to solidify their duopoly. Make the allocation of representatives proportional to their percentage of the popular vote and send people to Washington who represent the true partisan breakdown of their state. So, with that out of the way, we're going to go on a journey through November of this coming year. And YDHTY is going to be a platform for promoting electoral reform and creating a viable channel for third-party candidates to have their voices heard. And we already have a lineup of guests that is going to blow your socks off. Rodeo-riding libertarians from Texas, arch-conservatives from North Carolina, electoral reform activists, and we are kicking it off with Jenya Coulter of the U.S. Vote Foundation, otherwise known as Election Babe on Twitter. Jenya works to improve the quality of our electoral system, both through the foundation and her work as a local supervisor of elections in her home state of Florida. She brings a lot of data, a lot of knowledge on how elections are run, and you're not going to want to miss it. Little teaser. There are parts of the country where ballots are transported by boat. I am not kidding. So I hope you'll join us. As always, follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Theme music courtesy of Fellertac. YDHTY is produced by the Big Gino, Jason Putney. Until the next, this is Dan Sally saying adios.